The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back. Loving baseball when we were 12 and innocent. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm wrapping up the series right now with Charlie Vascellero. And coincidentally, he's here at a time when baseball, him personally, the whole real baseball world is suffering the loss of one of the greats of all time, probably the greatest fielding third baseman that ever lived. And I'll save the Clete Boyer discussion for another day. But Brooks Robinson passed, and Charlie Vascellero is with us. Charlie, we'll talk when you were 12 a little bit later. What was the first time Brooks Robinson came into your mind as a kid? You must have been a kid at that time.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience with Brooks.
Well, you know, I grew up on Long Island, and I grew up a Mets fan. But the Mets brought me into the larger world of baseball itself. And, you know, it didn't take long before I was following every team and following all the great players. And whenever these guys pass, I always go to my baseball cards. It's the first thing I do, because you might remember a few years back when there was that tremendous run of Hall of Famers that all passed in the same 12 months. You know, Hall of Fame kind of got wiped out by that period. Gaylord Perry, Joe Morgan, Hank Aaron was in there. You know, it was a huge run, and Whitey Ford. There was a whole bunch of them. Bob Gibson, Lou Brock. They all just seemed to be dropping like flies during the time of COVID too, which kind of magnified it all. And you know, each time one of those guys would pass, I'd get out my baseball cards and take a picture. And I said, how many do I got of this guy? I didn't even remember. How many do I got of Hank? How many do I got of Lou Brock? How many Bob Gibson cards do I have? Well, I just did that the other day. I went and got my Brooks Robinson cards. And this is going to lead me to the answer to your question, because that's when I became aware of Brooks, probably about the time I started buying cards, which looks to me was either 1972 or 73, when I was 8 and 9 years old. So when I was when Brooks came into my consciousness, I would probably say it was 1973. And I'm looking at his 1973 card now, his Topps 1973 card. It's got a picture of him kind of waiting on the ball at third base, kind of readying himself. And I've been reading about his footwork just recently, but that's when I first looked at Brooks. I probably had this card in my hand when I was 9 or 10 years old, and I'm holding it now too.
Before his passing, was he this beloved?
Yes. In this town, I've lived in Baltimore now for 25 years, and I could say there is no public figure, never mind the athletic arena, the sports world, there is no public figure, perhaps in the history of the city, as beloved as Brooks. And it has so much more to do with his humanity than what kind of ball player he was. Sure, that was the vehicle. Playing baseball was the vehicle that brought him to us. But then when we learned about him, when he started talking and sharing his spirit with us and the way he treated everybody else, I can tell you from firsthand accounts. I interviewed Brooks a couple of times for stories I was writing, and whether it was the first time or the fourth time or the fifth time, he looked at me in the eye as if we were old friends and regarded me that way. It was almost like talking to an uncle that you see periodically. And he knew that you had a familiarity with him, and he didn't want to let that down. He didn't want to let your preconceived notions about how nice you think he's going to be, he didn't want those to be wrong. He wanted that to be right. So you could see him kind of thinking that way. No matter who he talked to, he was always so sincere and genuine and so ridiculously kind that's why we're all crying around here right now.
he seems almost too real to be true. And what were his parents like? What did he get from them that molded him into the human being that he was?
Yeah, I was doing a little reading about that too. He was from Little Rock, Arkansas, and his father instilled this passion for baseball in him too. And there was something about where he came from. George Kell was from there too, and there was something in the earth down there. And it's funny, they made such a great guy. I think one of Brooks's greatest contributions to baseball and society was his relationship with Frank Robinson in 1966, which was incredibly tumultuous times in the country regarding race relations. And here Frank Robinson gets sent from Oakland, a black community in Oakland, to play in Baltimore. And Brooks is from one of the whitest parts of the Deep South there. And there was racial harmony immediately between these two guys. There was no tension about that. And Brooks, I don't think, ever had that. You sometimes associate opinions and philosophies with regions like a place like Arkansas. But, his parents must have done a great job with him with regards to treating all people like human beings, because the harmony that existed between Frank and Brooks Robinson was at the key to the great Orioles team's success.
Wow. Initially Frank was signed by Cincinnati, and as you know, and he came up in the Cincinnati farm system, which was all redneck in the South kind of existence, and people like Pinson and Jesse Gonder and had to go through what those guys went through, and to hear that Frank came out of all of that with the racial tolerance that he did is heartwarming. He too is gone. He passed 3 or 4 years ago, and I just love hearing stories like that. I had no idea that they were that close. All I can picture is F. Robbie, B. Robbie. Did they have that as their name on the back?
Their lockers were next to each other in the clubhouse, and they were as thick as thieves. And they just had Robinson on the back, and Frank made a joke. Frank made a joke with the reporters. He said, "I don't know why you keep getting us confused. Can't you see I wear number 20 and Brooks wears number 5?"
Frank was I live out in California, and I grew up in New York, so I'm a giant apologist. Those were some terrific years with Frank as the manager. Joe Morgan, those years. He was an icon. I mean, you see him around Oakland, just at McDonald's, sitting there. And you walk in, and all of a sudden, you want to go up to him and "Oh, Mr. Robinson." You couldn't even. He was the kind of guy you didn't feel as a mortal that you to approach him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think Brooks and Frank shared that to some extent. I wouldn't call Frank all warm and fuzzy the way Brooks was. No, Norman Rockwell wasn't going to paint a Frank Robinson portrait, but
no,
they are
he wasn't that.
They are products of a similar era, and I think that they were not afraid to talk to people. to just be candid. Frank was candid sometimes to a fault, but they were not afraid to talk to people. They would, you could approach both of them. Frank, maybe you would approach a little bit more cautiously, but I think it has some of a little bit of each other rubbed off on both of them.
Right. Good point. It comes to mind when you say Frank Robinson coming over to Baltimore, and maybe we could touch on this for a second. Milt Pappas. There was a story behind him. His wife disappeared at one time. Do you remember that story? And can you give me an idea of that? And
well, I'm familiar, of course, with the trade, with the one of the most lopsided trades in baseball history. It's been celebrated even in things like Bull Durham, and it's part of Annie's soliloquy in the opening of the movie, and it constantly gets referenced. And Pappas was at the time, Pappas, he was a formidable pitcher. He wasn't a bum, and the Reds were looking for something different, and they were troubled with Robinson for whatever reasons, personality clashes and things, and they didn't quite have what Frank would later regard as respect for him, and so they let him go, and then he comes here. I don't know about the situation with Pappas, his wife, but I know that once Robinson arrived here, that's one of the major turning points, Frank Robinson, in the history of the Orioles. That's when they become, the Yankees were not the big powerhouse in the league anymore. It was the Orioles. The Orioles were to set the standard in the mid-'60s and early '70s, and it all has to do with Robinson's arrival. You add him to the mix, and Brooks Robinson was the captain of the team. He had been there before. He was the MVP in '64, just 2 years earlier, and he was the leader in the clubhouse. But when you get a personality as big as Frank Robinson's in the clubhouse, then the immediate thing
goes the way.
Yeah, everybody thought they were in a clash, but Brooks welcomed Frank. He was the most welcoming. I was just reading a story by Tom Lavero here in the Washington Times, a writer, a friend of mine, and he was talking about how some of these other guys were giving Frank initiation rights, treating him like a new guy, because he's the new guy on the team. But Brooks said, no, none of that. He just kind of welcomed him with open arms, and he even handed over co-leadership. He goes, I'm the captain. You're the captain now too. Robinson kind of took the reins. Frank Robinson took the reins, but Brooks handed the reins to Frank. He said, "This is now your club."
Wow. To be able to do that 2 years after being an MVP and a great in his own right. Hey,
very exemplary of the generosity of Robinson's spirit right there. That's more about being human than being a ball player right there.
Right. I recall an interview I had with Mudcat Grant, who was traded by Cleveland in between games of a doubleheader. And he was traded to Minnesota. He didn't know a soul. He walks across the field to the locker room, and who greets him but Harmon Killebrew? And he puts his arm around him, and he takes him into the clubhouse, and he introduces him to all the other players. And Harmon Killebrew exhibits the same type of stuff, innards, I call them, what's inside your gut, that Brooks Robinson, in those moments, welcoming Frank into the club, into the Baltimore family, I equate that. That comes to mind for me, and that's high praise. Killer was it sounds like Mr. Killebrew instead of you call a guy Killer and you're trying to compliment him.
Yeah.
But Harmon was a terrific human being. One of the few that compares to, are you a better player than a better human than a ball player? And when you're a great ball player, that says something.
And I think that go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that kind of humanity, those displays of humanity are what endear players to fans. You asked me how the people in Baltimore feel about Brooks. I mean, we're all bleeding orange right now, and everybody's just talking about it. We haven't stopped. There's a memorial service on Monday here at Oriole Park. But the thing that made that is because anybody can be a ball player and do well at it. And I'm not to pick somebody out, but I'm going to pick one out. Here in Baltimore, we had Manny Machado, a superstar in the making. He came up, and it was exciting, and the fans were all very into him. But he had a kind of abrasive personality at times and didn't show us anything like this humility that we saw in Brooks. And I think that's how you become a lifelong fan favorite. It's not by what you do between the lines. It's really what you do outside of the lines.
Right. Hey, let me talk to you just a second about your Baltimore Oriole New York Met Connect. In 1969 in the World Series, the last out was made by the future manager of the New York Mets, Davey Johnson.
Indeed.
He's a man I think he's the best Met manager, Gil Hodges notwithstanding, that the Mets that they ever had. And can you give me some idea about the life of, real quick, about the life of Davey Johnson, what he meant to Baltimore as well as the Mets?
It's funny. I just mentioned Tom Lovin, one of my favorite writers out here. I was reading that piece about what he wrote about Brooks and Frank years ago. But in today's paper, he had an interview with Davey Johnson, and he was talking to Davey Johnson about Brooks. Yeah, so it does bring it home for a guy like me. I love Johnson in multiple directions. Yes, that his time with the Mets was, a golden era for the franchise, and he had a masterful hand. He was so good at not pushing too hard on the guys. He kind of let those wild Mets run, and that team had a reputation for some pretty scandalous and behavior. There were a lot of scoundrels on that team, but he orchestrated it. He let it go in different directions and didn't over discipline where some guys might have. I don't know how Billy Martin would have handled that group. He'd probably been getting in fist fights with half of them. But Johnson kind of let them do what they had to do, and he was intelligent enough and had a good. He had Mel Stottlemyre as his pitching coach, and there was a brain trust there, which goes up above to Frank Cashen, another Baltimore connection. You got Cashen was the GM of the Orioles during the years when the Mets were beating them in the World Series.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And do you remember the immortal words of Frank Robinson? He said, as I recall, in the introductions to the different players before the series began, who the hell is Rod Gasper?
Yeah.
Quote.
And he got his first name wrong because his real name is Rod, and Frank said Ron Gasper, and some people thought he was mixing Swoboda and Gasper, which they were both kind of platoon players, and he was kind of melding them into one. And basically, what everybody thought was he didn't have knowledge of who his opponent was. Even he had this vague idea. Remember, they didn't play interleague baseball back then, and he's just looking at the Mets as a bunch of relatively anonymous guys. And those words certainly came back to haunt him.
Up until 1969, they had been relatively anonymous. It was the real miracle of my sports fandom, that New York Met, Gil Hodges run team of 69. Hey, let's talk about you for a second, where you were at age 12. Who was your favorite team? I picked age 12 for the series because enthusiasm meets intellect as a kid.
Yeah.
If you're gonna, you understand that before age 12, you're basically just who are these guys? This not. When you become age 12, you start thinking of it differently. You start thinking of the history of baseball and the future of baseball. So let me ask, what year were you age 12?
I was age 12 in 1976. Now, I had already committed to the Mets a few years earlier. I went to my first game when I was 8 years old in 1972. And the 1973 Mets, who lost the World Series to the Oakland A's in such heartbreaking fashion, that was my first broken heart. And I was 9 years old, and that's when I suffered my first broken heart at the hands of the 73 Mets. So by the time 76 came around, you talk about starting to develop a more adult mind, you know, and the in-between years in 74, 75, and 76, there was a tremendous fall off in the team. They were nowhere near as good in 76 as they were in 73. And I started to develop what a lot of us Mets fans know, a cynicism that's associated with being a Mets fan, that being a Mets fan was now something I wasn't necessarily always going to enjoy. Sometimes I would simply have to endure it. And I think by that time,
welcome. I'm an original Mets fan, and what you're talking about was the Bruce Brocaire
era. What I like to call the Doug Flynn days. Yes.
Yes. Well, you touch a little sore spot in me. Doug Flynn was tremendously underrated. He came over with Norman and Pat Zachary. And
the best player in that deal was Steve Henderson. He was the best. He was the best player in that deal.
I think Flynn was. Flynn was a terrific infielder.
I like Henderson a little bit more, but I understand. Flynn held down that spot at second base, but I'll never forget the Hen-do, can-do home run.
Oh, yes. It's been a bittersweet experience with the Mets for all these many years, and with baseball in general, which leads me to ask you, how has baseball changed in your eyes for the better and the worse since you were 12?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was 12, I was addicted and very involved. I went to Shea Stadium a lot when I was a kid. I grew up on the island. And then when I was 14, we moved to Arizona, my family. And that was a hit as far as being a baseball fan is concerned. I didn't have the ready access. I didn't have the instant access to the Mets. I had to follow them from a distance. And for a few years, I even probably lost touch with them during some of the high school years. I wasn't, and they were miserable as a team. But the game itself was obviously evolving at that point. Now, I came into this. There was divisional play came in 1969, so I was 5 then. But the next round of divisional expansion and things like the wild card and the playoffs and all these new teams. I remember my first expansion experience was the Seattle Mariners and the Toronto Blue Jays. So now I'm seeing the game grow a little bit. I'm seeing more teams come in. The 80s. I remember the strike, of course, in '81 and the split season. So now I'm becoming more aware of the business aspect of the game, free agency, all this, the idea that your players could move, that you could lose your favorite player in an instant, the Tom Seaver Midnight Massacre, things like that. So like anything else in life, you're kind of losing some of your innocence along the way as these changes are happening. And it's funny you asked this question in this year, where we saw so many changes this year. I can't remember another year where they institute, so many rule changes. And the game really did change right before your eyes. The games are played much quicker. I don't know if how important that is to you. To some people it is. It wasn't a major concern of mine, but now that it's happened, it didn't really bother me. I like to spend as much time at the ballpark as I can, but I didn't mind those quicker games. The action seemed to move a little faster. So I was very critical of it in the beginning. I thought, what are they doing to my game? But some of it ended up being okay. I don't like the ghost runner in the extra innings, and I don't like the automatic intentional walk. I think those pitches should be thrown. Those are two of my pet peeves, but some of the other stuff I'm okay with.
Okay, let me tell you my real pet peeve besides the runner on second and in extra innings, and that's been kind of beaten to death a little bit. But so it goes that we have permanently bastardized the game by doing that. You mentioned that you didn't mind being at the ballpark a little later. Hey, an extra inning game is exciting.
Yeah.
Especially as a Met fan, we have so much history with playing the Phillies, all these things. So we lose that. But you know what we lose? And I mentioned the bastardization of the game, but how about the bastardization of the rule book? You get a step closer to, because the bases are bigger, you can't compare Maury Wills to what's going on today. And
well, Ronald Acuna just stole 70 bases. Now, that's a pretty high number, and we haven't really seen that kind of stuff going on in a while. So I think we are on the cusp of a new era with regards to stolen bases, because they should be more plentiful, and I'm surprised more guys didn't steal more bases. There was probably a general increase. I'm sure there was, but I would imagine that's going to continue to trend upward. And yes, that does change the way you look at the record. Is it easier to steal a base now? It might be. You get those extra couple of inches. It might be. So
plus the pitches thrown over, you could only throw over a couple of times. Yep. So the base.
But I don't know that we're ever going to see 130. I still don't think we'll ever see that Rickey Henderson record broken. I just don't think so.
No, Rickey was a podcast waiting to happen.
Yeah.
We could talk Rickey stories for years, let alone a podcast. Hey, Charlie, I promised you a time limit that I wouldn't keep you any longer than I am. And I just want to tell you that you got to come back more often. We have had some terrific talks over the years. This one is just as good as the others. So
you want to ask me anything about the current Orioles? I got a couple more minutes.
Okay. Talk about them and the silly logo. You don't want to mention that.
The silly logo is the one they have the best luck with. That's the one they always have on when they're winning. But it's funny, this team, it's been pure magic here in this city right now, and you couldn't ask to be in a better baseball town than Baltimore at this moment. They clinched the division for the first time in basically 10 years last night. The last time was 2014, and we have not had this much excitement in this city since then. The ballpark rumbles and breathes. It feels like it's rocking when you're in it, when that many people are there. And this whole business about Brooks passing right while this was happening, Monday here in Baltimore, they're having a memorial service for him at the ballpark at 10 a.m. All the parking is free. They're opening up the lots, and they're opening up the ballpark. And I got a feeling 50,000 people are going to show up for that event on a Monday morning. It's going to be insane. I live near a light rail station, so I can take the train. But traffic is going to be at a standstill. And think of the timing of that ceremony. The last regular season game is on Sunday this year. Now, Orioles are already in. These next 3 games basically don't matter. They got 3 games to get some guys, maybe get some of the bench guys a little time and rearrange their pitching rotation. So the games themselves aren't going to be all that significant. But that ceremony is going to come on the day after the last regular season game. And I couldn't even, that's one of those things where it sounds like the baseball gods wrote the script.
Nice. I'm glad you're going through that, because Baltimore, the fans have suffered over the years.
Yes. Another thing, during last night's game, they made the announcement that John Angelos, the owner, the principal owner of the Orioles, signed a 30-year lease agreement with the city. This was looming over the team and the fans all year long. Everybody's wondering, when are you going to come to terms? Are we going to lose this team? Are we going to lose? So that was actually announced last night during the pennant clinching game, the 100th win of the season. So that was just a wonderful confluence of events that adds even more to this mix, this big stew we got in front of us.
Oh, wow. Well, hey, Charlie, tell me about something that I remember that you do that much of my audience probably won't. You take care of Emmett Ashford's grave.
Yes, I do. In Cooperstown, New York, I discovered his burial site probably almost a decade ago, and when I first came upon it, it was the top of his headstone. It was one of them flat ones. It wasn't an upright one. It was one of those flat ones. It had turned color. It had a layer of, I don't know what you would call, mold on it, a little bit of moss growing on it. You could barely read the engraving into the thing. It was all filled with dirt. And so I took it upon myself to have it cleaned. I found the guy who's the caretaker of the cemetery there and hired him to power wash it. He actually put it on a dolly and moved it over to his driveway where he had a power washer, and took it back and came back all clean and almost white, like the original color of whatever the concrete slab was. And you could read everything perfectly. And then I put together a little shadow box shrine that explained to people who might not know who was lying there, who was there. And I got pictures of Emmett Ashford and other iconic African-American pioneers. I put him in the box to put him in his context as the first African-American umpire. I put a Jackie Robinson card in there. I put a Frank Robinson card in there. I put a Bill White baseball in there. So I put pictures of these other significant firsts in the African-American community to tell the story. Of course, weather beat that down. That box is since disintegrated, but I go back still every time I'm in Cooperstown and clean it up and tidy it up and put some kind of something on display there, maybe a ball and strike indicator or a ball with a message on it, some action figures. And, I sit with him for a while and have a beer while I'm hanging out. And sometimes one of my friends will come over from the hall, or the editor of the newspaper, and we'll just kind of have a impromptu gathering at the cemetery. Wow.
To the audience, I'm going to ask you rhetorically, can you see why I'm delighted to have Charlie Vascellero here? I'll bet you can. Thank you, my friend. Come back soon.
All right, Ralph. Always a pleasure. I'll look forward to it.
I will post this and send you a link. And Thank you. My people would say Zeigesund, which means it's a Yiddish term. I'll let you find out what it means, and
I'll look it up.
And you give me a word in Italy in Italian to look up. How about that?
Oh, I'm gonna have to think of one for you. I mean, I know the simple ones, but I don't know if I can find an esoteric one for you.
Okay. Next time we'll talk about.
They used to say Ashpet all the time. I don't know if you know that one. I always heard Ashpet when I was a kid.
Okay, I will.
That's something the older folks would say to you.
Well, you can't find many older folks than me, so I'm not worried about that. that won't get in the way.
All right.
Thanks again, Charlie, and thank you for listening, everybody. It's a terrific day. Let me tell you, when I get to talk baseball with the Charlie Vascellero, it's a terrific day. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, we're out of here. Adios and happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.